Welcome everyone. We have 38 attendees, and I'm so happy that everyone is here for Tim Richards' program, Discovering a Tide Mill in Truro. We're gonna continue to let attendees come in for the next couple of minutes, and we'll try to begin this webinar right around 5 o'clock. Tim, will your brother Andrew be attending?
I believe so. I'm not sure if you see him there yet, but I expect that he will be.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah. So nice to have his artwork as part of your presentation.
I feel the same way. It's great. It was really great to be able to work with him and put together these artists' creations of what this mill might have looked like.
Yeah, they're really wonderful. Okay, we have 52 attendees. Oh, thank you, Kristen. Thank you. Glad to see that Andy will be coming. So it is 5 o'clock and we have 58 attendees. So we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to today's program, Discovering a Tide Mill in Truro with Tim Richards. I'm Lauren Kaufman, Director of the Highland House Museum in Truro, and I'm really happy to welcome you all here to today's program. Tim will talk for around 45 minutes today, and when he's done, we'll take all of your questions. Please feel free at any point, if a question comes to mind while Tim is talking, to type it into the Q&A feature, and we will try to get to all of them at the end. And I wanted to mention that we do not charge admission for our webinars. We do welcome donations, and you can easily do that by going to our website, which is www.trurohistoricalsociety.org. So thank you very much for your generous support. We appreciate that. Wanted to mention that we have a tremendous season planned for this summer. We are still planning to continue doing webinars. We're hoping to have a couple of in-person programs later in the season, but we are really happy that we have a fabulous schedule planned for this summer with a great concentrated focus on the history and culture of the Wampanoag people. So look to our website for all upcoming programs. And before we begin, I want to mention that we have another great program coming up next Wednesday. We're offering a webinar on gardening on the Cape with C.L. Fornari, who is a gardening expert and self-described plant geek. So that'll be next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. So for all of you avid gardeners, you don't want to miss that. So we're going to get started, and I'd like to introduce you to Tim Richards. Tim has been coming to Truro for a very long time, since 1958. His family owned a house on North Pamet Road, and in 2017, Tim and his wife, Meg Clark, bought a home on Mill Pond Road, and since then, Tim and Meg have spent quite a bit of time researching the Truro Tide Mill, which has resulted in today's program. Just to give you a little background about Tim, he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania and consults on business strategies for engagement with international governments. Tim retired from GE in early 2019 after working there for 23 years. And during his final 2 years at GE, Tim was responsible for all international government affairs. Sounds like a big job, Tim. Other GE leadership roles included energy policy, government affairs in the Middle East, North Africa, based in Abu Dhabi. Prior to joining GE, he spent 8 years with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So he's got a really interesting, strong background. And I think you're in for a treat today. This is going to be a fantastic program. So I am going to say goodbye to you all and hand it over to Tim, and then I'll see you at the end for the questions.
Lauren, thank you very much. And thank you to the Truro Historical Society for holding this webinar. I'd also like to say thank you to some of my friends at an organization called the Tide Mill Institute, who have been so supportive and who have provided so much guidance and information about tide mills, without which none of this would be possible. I'd also like to say thank you to 3 members of my family. First of all, my father, Noble Richards, who I believe is on today. My father and I made the first visit to the Cobb Archive, which we'll talk about in a minute, and he has remained interested in the project and provided feedback on the project throughout. I'd also like to thank my brother Andrew, who is a local artist and has done the artist's conceptions that you see here on this first page, and which we'll see in a couple of other instances during the course of this presentation. And finally, my wife Meg, who has been part of all of this from the very beginning and has been a tremendous inspiration and has had ideas about how we should go about doing this research, and has gotten her hands dirty, literally working on cataloging stones that may or may not have been part of this tide mill. In any case, thank you all for joining. That's the most important thing. I really appreciate your taking your time to learn about this subject. This afternoon, we're going to learn about a tide mill that existed in Truro. We'll learn about what a tide mill was. We will talk about its history, some of the major events in the life of that tide mill, some of the people that were associated with the tide mill, and finally, we'll take a brief look at the end on the potential for tidal power in the future as a future zero carbon energy resource. As Lauren said, I've been coming to Truro since I was a baby, and every summer, and now more recently, more frequently than that. And I've walked and biked and driven and run on Mill Pond Road countless times, hundreds of times. But until Meg and I bought our house on Mill Pond Road, it never had occurred to me what Mill Pond Road was named after. And finally, after we did buy the house, we asked the question. It took us a while. And that's when my father and I decided we would visit the Cobb Archive to learn about, was there a mill and what could be discovered about that mill. So we did that during the week after Thanksgiving in 2018. And the volunteers at the Cobb Archive were tremendous. We met Helen McNeil Ashton right away, and she helped to guide us to a number of resources. And right away, she helped us to find we actually found this quotation on the right side in a history of Barnstable County, but it really first was written in a history of Plymouth County by Simeon Hurd in 1884. And this sentence is really the framework for all of the research that has been done since then. So it says, in the latter part of the 18th century, a water mill for grinding was erected on the south side of the Pamet River, and in 1844, a better one was erected upon the site, which in its turn was abandoned before 1860 and taken down. We'll be looking at each of the elements of that sentence, but that sentence is critical. We also found, with the help of Helen and others, we found a number of maps that show the mill on Mill Pond. This is one from 1795. You can see here, this is the entrance to the Pamet River at that time up toward Corn Hill, the main body of the river flowing to the east there. And then over here to the south of the Pamet, you can read Mill Pond. And you can't read, but if one has a magnifying glass and the original of this map, this word is definitely mill. And this word is probably either west or maybe water. But in any case, here in 1795, we have documentation that in fact there was a mill here on Mill Pond Road. And so lesson one from all of this exercise is notice the obvious. If a road is called Mill Pond Road, if a pond is called Mill Pond, there's a very high likelihood that there was, in fact, a mill there. To give you more perspective on where the mill was located, here's a Google satellite photograph of the area. And you can see here's Pamet Harbor, here's the pier, the yacht club. It looks like somebody's having a wedding because there's a tent there. This is the railroad bed. And then coming over here, we have Mill Pond Road running toward Depot Road to give you some sense of where we are. In terms of nomenclature, I'm going to call this Mill Pond. That's what it was originally called. It is actually the pond that was created by damming Mill Creek. And this is Mill Creek. Frequently today, people really refer to the whole area as Mill Pond, but for our purposes, this is Mill Pond, this is Mill Creek. You can see the sinewy creek bed right there that is actually quite visible at low tide. Now, based on an 1858 map, there was an 1858 map that shows houses which are still in the same locations. And so I was able to take that map, overlay it onto this Google Earth photograph. Here are some of these houses. There's one over here. And then there was also an indication of where the mill was. And if you do that, the mill turns out to have been almost exactly where you would expect it to have been, right about where the present day culvert comes under Mill Pond Road, right in this area. It may have been a little north of that. Certainly it was on the north side of the sluiceway, but it was in this vicinity right here, right about the bend and where the culvert is on Mill Pond Road. Now, about this point, you're probably thinking this is all very interesting, but what is a tide mill? And I didn't know what a tide mill was either when I started this research. Most fundamentally, tide mills rely on the tidal range. They take the difference in the water levels at high tide versus the water levels at low tide and create a hydraulic head, which creates enough pressure to drive a mill. Usually you have tide mills in locations where there isn't enough freshwater flow to power a mill. And that is certainly the case here in Truro, where the freshwater streams, the few freshwater streams that there are, don't have the power to drive a mill. And here is the tide gauge down on the pier. We know, those of us who live in Truro or come to Truro regularly know that the tidal range in Truro is at a half moon, it's about 7.5 feet of tidal range. At a full moon or a new moon, it can be 12.5 feet or even sometimes more. And those of us who have sailed or kayaked in the Pamet River know just how powerful the tidal flows can be as we go from either low tide to high tide or high tide to low tide. Let's take a look at how a tide mill operates. This is from a brochure for the Elling Mill, which is a operating tide mill in Hampshire, England. So we're going to have a few words that are sort of British words that aren't the words we would use in the US, but the illustrations are quite helpful. The most important thing about a tide mill is to create a tide pond, or we call it the mill pond, and that's done by building a dam. So here you have a dam across what was a free-flowing tidal estuary. So there's a dam there. The next thing that you need is you need to let the water come through the dam into your tide pond. And so you need what they call sea hatches. In the US, we might call them tide gates. In either case, the water can flow through those tide gates into the pond. The next thing you need is a sluiceway where you can control the release of water onto a water wheel. And the water wheel then spins and turns either grindstones or sawmill saws or other milling equipment. So that's the start. Let's go now to high tide. So the water's been flowing in down here as the tide is rising. At high tide, the water levels are the same on both sides of the dam. We could call this the bay side, this is the pond side. And the tide has risen to that high tide level. At that point, the miller closes the sea hatches, and now the water in the pond is retained in the pond, and the tide starts to go out. We'll go down to the lower right now. Now the tide begins to fall, and at the point where the miller feels that there's enough of a difference in the height between the water that's behind the dam and the water that is receding on the bay side, then the miller begins to release water through the sluiceway to turn the water wheel to grind grain. This usually would happen in a place like Truro. This probably took about 3 hours after high tide, so that you would get a differential of somewhere between maybe a maximum of 6 feet, 6.5 feet, and a minimum of around 4 feet, 3.5 to 4 feet of differential between these two heights. And that's how a tide mill operates. Now, to get some idea of the force of water that could be released, here's the tide going out through the present day culvert between Mill Pond and Mill Creek. To me, it sometimes sounds like an aircraft engine. It's incredibly powerful. And we have to remember that this power that we just saw is achieved without holding the water back at all today. The only thing holding the water back is the fact that there's a constriction with a 33-inch pipe instead of free flow. But imagine how much more power you could get if you not only had this, but you also had a 3 to 6 foot drop of the water before it started its journey. Whoops, sorry. Grist mills were incredibly important to colonial era towns. The ability to apply wind power or tidal power to convert grains into flour was something which greatly reduced the human labor required for that critical task. And this value was recognized by towns. There's a Provincetown Advocate article from 1977 that gives a sense of the importance of mills. It talks about the fact that the miller and the mill were so important to the towns that they were exempt from taxes, and the miller was also exempt from serving in the militia, and he was exempt from serving in public office. So there were real perks associated with operating a mill, and towns competed to obtain the services of really top quality millers and get investment in mills. The earliest grist mills in Truro were windmills, and the one that you see here was built by Thomas Paine. It was actually built in Plymouth in 1680, and this is now the mill that's in Eastham, and you see it from Route 6. But it was in Truro from 1770 to 1793, so it was a competitor and a contemporary of the tide mill when the tide mill was first built. Even though all of the original mills in Truro were windmills, tide mill technology was by no means unknown. In fact, it was relatively common both back in England and in the early colonial period. This photograph, which admittedly is difficult to see because it's a 19th century photograph that was printed in a newspaper that year and is now online, but it gives you an idea. This is a tide mill that was built in Barnstable in about 1658. So 38 years after the Pilgrims have sailed into Plymouth, well, first to Provincetown, then to Plymouth, the Blish tide mill has been established in Barnstable. And tide mill technology was very well known in Europe. There are tide mills in France and Ireland that date to the 6th century, and there's an excavation going on in London now of what is believed to be a Roman era tide mill on the Thames. So it's a long-standing technology. It just was that it wasn't applied in Truro right away, but it was applied very widely elsewhere. In fact, there are 450 known tide mills in North America, of which 40 are in Massachusetts. And I suspect, after having looked into this a bit on the Cape, that there are actually more than 40 historical tide mills in Massachusetts. The story of the Truro Tide Mill begins before 1790, when a group of owners built a dam across Mill Creek, and they erected a mill below the dam. This is the first record that I've found of the mill. It's a deed from December 1790, through which the estate of Samuel Rich sells 1/8 of the entire mill complex to a housewright named Benjamin Hinckley. There's reason to believe that Hinckley was already an owner, because ultimately members of his family, owned by the 1860s, owned about a quarter of the mill pond, and the dam. So it's quite likely that Hinckley himself was already an owner. In any case, the deed makes clear some of the things that were in that earlier history of Plymouth County entry. It makes clear that the mill was a water mill, and that it served as a grist mill for grinding grain. And that would have been primarily corn and rye. The deed also gives us a value for the entire tide mill complex. 24 pounds and 6 shillings for 1/8 of the complex. If you convert that into $1790 and you multiply it by 8 to get the entire mill, it's $850 approximately. And to give you an idea of what that means, this tide mill was sold in the same year as a house and a barn in Orleans with 3 acres. That house and barn with 3 acres sold for under $200 when converted to dollars. So the tide mill was worth more than 4 times the value of that house and a barn. And there's also a sale of a windmill in Wellfleet in 1801 and 1802 to a man named Matthias Ryder. And the tide mill is also worth 4 times as much as that Wellfleet windmill. Now, we should note that the land itself, the marshland on which the tide mill was built, is quite valuable. And that's mainly, I think, because they could produce salt hay in that marshland. There are a number of records of sales of land in the vicinity to give us this value. But even if you take the remaining value of that tide mill, it's still 2.5 times more than the Wellfleet windmill. There are a few important reasons for that. Most importantly, the windmills at that time and throughout the 19th century really could not operate with less than 15 miles per hour of wind. If I look out my window right now, there's probably less than 5 miles per hour worth of wind. And as those of you who come to Truro know, especially during the summer months, there can be many days when the wind does not reach 15 miles an hour, or only reaches that for a little period. The tide mill, by contrast, was both highly predictable and highly reliable. You knew that twice a day there would be a high tide and a low tide, and that you could operate the mill for 11 to 12 hours per day. So that was of considerable value in and of itself. In terms of cost of production, windmills had a much lower upfront cost. They didn't have to acquire all the land and build a dam, etc. But tide mills could operate at very low costs once you had them all set up, whereas windmills required new sails and more adjustments throughout. So the tide mill had a operating cost advantage. And finally, the tide mill had a logistical advantage because it was located right on a waterway that connected quickly to the main wharfs of Pamet Harbor. So if grain were brought in, aside from the grain grown in town, when grain was brought in and sold into the town, it could be quickly transferred to the tide mill for grinding. So by enlisting the power of the tides to grind flour in Truro, Samuel Rich and Benjamin Hinckley and the other owners enjoyed more than just those perks and tax benefits and accolades. They also had created a really valuable business that was meeting the needs of the town. We don't have a contemporary picture of the tide mill. One thing we know for sure, though, is that from 1790 to 1844, it had a vertical wheel. As if we look at this 1841 map, it has this almost whimsical drawing of a water wheel with the bottom of that water wheel is right there in the sluiceway, and showing us clearly that this was a mill with an external vertical wheel. There's also a couple of references in deeds that make reference to a straight line toward the water mill, the wheel on the water mill. And so we know also the alignment of the mill, but and that's further evidence that it was a vertical wheel. Vertical wheels on tide mills like the one in Truro would almost certainly be what was called an undershot wheel, meaning that if we look at this illustration, here's the water flowing in on the sluiceway. It drops down and it strikes these blades at the bottom and turns the wheel in a clockwise direction in this case. And you can see that that turns an axle, it's geared, and it sends via a shaft, it turns the grinding stones up here. And this is a hopper through which the grain is introduced into the grinding stones. So that's how this would have worked. It would be what we call an undershot wheel operating this mill. And here is Andrew's depiction of what the mill might have looked like in the early 1800s. This is based on what we know about this mill and also what other mills that still survive in the area looked like. Now let's meet some of the people associated with the tide mill in the 19th century. This is a photograph of Ruth Hinckley Holsbury. She and her sister, Thankful Hinckley, were the granddaughters of that housewright, Benjamin Hinckley, who owned an eighth or a quarter of the mill back in 1790. And they basically create the continuity between Benjamin Hinckley and the owners down the road. They grew up in a house on what's now Depot Road near Holsbury Square, near where Bridge Road comes in. The family suffered more than its share of losses in the course of their lives, including the loss of Ruth and Thankful's father before Thankful was 10. And in February of 1825, when she was 18, Thankful married a promising young Truro man named Josiah Damon Atkins. Tragically, Atkins was a sailor, a fisherman probably. He was swept off of his ship off of Race Point and drowned 7 months after they were married. 2 years after Atkins' death, Thankful remarried, and she married a man named Anthony Snow Collins, who was also then listed in the census document and in the marriage documents as a mariner. And it wouldn't be surprising, given the loss of her first husband at sea, if Thankful and members of her family might have arranged for her second husband, Collins, to have a financially stable and perhaps most importantly shore-based role in the family business, which was milling. Here's a 1945 photo of the house where Thankful and Anthony Snow Collins lived on what is now Depot Road. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Anthony Snow Collins. He was clearly a miller at this mill, and we know a bit about him. He was, first of all, almost certainly not named Anthony Snow Collins when he was born. He was born in Portugal in 1806 of non-American parents. That's information from census documents. And somehow he came to Truro by the time he was in his late teens. It seems quite possible that a ship from Truro or a ship crewed by men from Truro called in a Portuguese port. It could have been the Azores or the Cape Verde Islands. And young Anthony somehow found his way aboard that vessel, and he arrived in the United States. Now, it seems that perhaps he did not enter the country with any formalities, because when he does become a US citizen through naturalization in 1847, the entry fields for port and date of entry are blank. So quite likely he did not come into the country in a normal legalized manner. We don't know exactly when Collins made the transition from seafaring to milling, but in any case, by 1835, after he and Thankful had been married for 7 years, Collins had saved enough to buy half of his mother-in-law's house for what I think was a bargain basement price of $40. He was also an important member of the community. By the 1840s, he was serving as an inspector of roads for the town of Truro, and he collected taxes on behalf of the town. This despite the fact that he was not a US citizen until 1847. He was also included by his peers in major business ventures and social clubs, such as the Elkanah Payne and Company Trading Company. By the 1850 census, and quite possibly before, but we don't have any documentation, Collins' profession was miller. And he continued to list his profession as miller in the Massachusetts census of 1855. Thankful and Anthony remained married until her death in 1881, and they continued to live on Depot Road. They had no children, but they did raise a girl named Lucy Ellen Rich, and she continued to live with them until she was married at the age of 18. There's a fascinating and somewhat mysterious story associated with Lucy Ellen Rich, which we don't have time to go into now, but which I at least am going to continue to pursue. So let's move to the second phrase of that sentence that we found in the Cobb Archive that November of 2018. In 1844, a better mill was erected upon the site. To understand the context of that development, Truro was in a boom period between the late 1830s and through the 1840s. In 1830, it's hard to imagine actually what our current harbor looked like in 1836. In that year, there were 63 fishing boats and 512 men operating out of Pamet Harbor. The harbor had 3 wharves crowded with stores and storage sheds and equipment for loading and unloading fish and supplies. There was a shipyard which produced 15 brigs and schooners between 1837 and 1851. And the area was surrounded with salt works, so there was additional commercial activity from the salt works. There was a sail loft, there was a blacksmith shop. 3 sailing ships a day went back and forth to Boston as packets. They would bring the fish to market and supplies back to Truro. So it was an incredibly dynamic time in the history of Truro, and not surprising that the owners of the Tide Mill might think about adding to their investment. Driven by all that activity, the town's population leapt from 1547 in 1830 to over 2,000 by 1850, a 33% increase in only 20 years. From a miller's point of view, an increase in the population meant more mouths to feed, which meant more demand for grinding flour. But it was not assured that a 50-year-old Tide Mill was going to have its share of that new business. In 1840, Truro continued to have 3 windmills in addition to the Tide Mill, and these windmills were newer windmills. The one you see here, this is an illustration from Shebna Rich's book, Landmarks and Seamarks. And this mill had blades that were about 3 feet longer than the one we saw earlier, the Thomas Paine windmill. It was a more powerful windmill, and one which could operate over a wider range of wind conditions. So the Tide Mill had really serious competition, and this very well may have pressured the Tide Mill owners to want to increase their mill's horsepower and operating hours. At the same time, some of the most important owners of the Tide Mill were likely faced a separate financial challenge. In 1841, in the early part of the year, Anthony Snow Collins and his brother-in-law, Ruth's husband, Henry Holsbury, and Sears Rich, all of whom were owners of the mill, all mortgaged their houses to the newly created Truro Fire and Marine Insurance Company. And these mortgages likely represented their investment in the company. As Shebna Rich records in his history, the stockholders were mostly men of small means who gave their notes for nearly the amount of their subscriptions. Notes, in this case, being the mortgages. And certainly Anthony Snow Collins would have qualified as a man of small means. So these were major investments. And those investments could not have been less fortuitously timed. Those of you who know Truro well will recall that on October 2nd, 1841, a powerful storm surprised the fishing fleet on Georges Bank. This is a memorial in Snows Cemetery in Truro to those who lost their lives in the storm. 57 men and boys from Truro, and 7 Truro vessels were lost. Claims resulting from the storm bankrupt the Truro Fire and Marine Insurance Company before its first birthday. And as Rich notes, the stockholders were obliged to pay the face of their notes without receiving a single dividend. So in the situation that Collins and Holsbury and Rich found themselves, they may very well have felt that it was even more important to secure additional returns from the tide mill. And 3 years later, they did proceed with the upgrade to the mill. The primary enhancement likely came in water wheel technology. By the 1830s, inventors were introducing a new generation of water wheels. Basically, these were the predecessors of modern day hydraulic turbines. One of those was known as a reaction wheel, which was patented by a man named Calvin Wing of Maine in 1831. And one of those reaction wheels was installed at the Boston City Mills, where the millers in Truro would have had a very good opportunity to have either heard about it or seen it. And the key thing about these reaction wheels was that water was no longer sent down an open sluiceway to run into the wheel. It was actually directed into the wheel through a spout. And here we see a quotation from a deed of sale of a piece of the mill pond in 1864, and it refers to a spout through the dike, which is a pretty strong indication that they had shifted over to the other type of technology, the newer type of technology. We also see in this particular illustration, this deed required the owner to maintain a ditch 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep leading to the spout and the dike. And this is mill pond today. Very possibly this is the same ditch that was being maintained by the owners to lead water into that spout. There's another reason to believe that the new mill involved a new wheel, like the reaction wheel, and that's a case of the Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. After 1844, I did not see any deeds that make reference to an external wheel on the mill. I'd like to first preface this chart by saying that it's only an estimate, and also say a special thank you to Bob Gordon, who is a professor emeritus of Yale University in geophysics, and who has been kind enough to work with me on doing some estimates of the power output from the mill. The important thing here is if this change was to a reaction wheel, the reaction wheel has 2 big advantages over the old undershot wheel. First of all, the reaction wheel is about twice as efficient, meaning it takes the potential power of all that water flowing through it and doubles the amount of power output from it. And the other thing it does is it operates even when submerged. So at least for a period when submerged, these reaction wheels could operate, whereas the undershot wheels could not. So we go in terms of efficiency, we improve that, and we improve the number of hours per day. And the net result is that this is what the old 1790 undershot wheel could achieve, a range of maybe 100 to 200 kilowatt hours. And the new mill with that reaction wheel could have achieved something more in the range of 200 to 350. So a substantial improvement. But all of this improvement came at a cost. The reaction wheel, according to Bob Gordon's research, sold to the Boston City Mills for $450. So that alone is more than half of the cost of the entire mill in the beginning, or at least the value of the entire mill in the beginning. And that doesn't include modifications to the dam and the mill. So the owners who had already lost thousands of dollars together in the Truro Fire and Marine Insurance situation now had doubled down on their investment into the tide mill. And here is another drawing by Andrew Richards of what the mill would have looked like when it had a reaction wheel instead of the undershot wheel. So you see there's no external wheel, a smaller point of output, and otherwise you can't see too much in terms of the change in the technology, because the reaction wheel sat directly below the mill and the shaft went directly up from the reaction wheel to the millstones, perhaps with a couple of gears to adjust it, to adjust the rate of speed. Now, there was another situation in the 1840s. The water wheel was not the only upgrade to the mill. The mill also had a legal situation which required improvement. And that was that the original owners had built the dam across Mill Creek without Commonwealth authorization. Town authorities and the proprietors lived with this for 50 years. It may have been something like the Chinese proverb that the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, or in this case, the bay is wide and the Commonwealth authorities are far away. But something changed and something prompted a decision to address the issue. It might have been that the proprietors had just invested additional funds into this mill and they wanted to be secure against possible legal challenge. It might have been that this man, Alan Hinckley, who is not a close relative of Benjamin Hinckley, who was a representative of the Cape Cod area and was a Truro resident. He was a representative in the Massachusetts legislature. He may have wanted to bring his town into compliance with state law. And finally, maybe the town of Truro wanted to build Mill Pond Road on top of the dam, but they couldn't do so with a illegal structure. In any case, Hinckley petitioned the Massachusetts legislature to authorize the continuation of the operation. And in 1847, the legislature did exactly that. It authorized the doings of the owners in constructing and continuing the dam. So they gave prospective and retrospective authorization to the dam. This is the something we now can see about Mill Pond Road. Whether that was actually a result of the 1847 legislation or not is not clear, but it definitely occurred after the 1847 legislation. Here's an 1848 map that's primarily showing salt works, but there is no road across the dam here. But by 1858, there is. So there was, in fact, if not a cause and effect, there was a possibility that that was one of the reasons why the legislature passed that bill. It's worth noting also that Anthony Snow Collins served as a surveyor of roads. And so he might have been in a position to have put together a deal to authorize or to create the road on the pond. At some point between 1790 and 1860, the proprietors of the Tide Mill created a deed of division. And that deed of division detailed the common responsibilities of the owners. It also divided Mill Pond into 41 pie-shaped pieces. So these were literally physical lots that were bought and sold. And they represented shares in the mill, but they were also ownership of pieces of land. So it's a rather creative solution. And these lots were, if there were 8 owners in the beginning, which it appears there might have been, then these lots were now 5-to-1 splits. Plus, they added a 41st lot, which is the one that goes right down where the ditch was to the spout. So that could be almost a golden share. The ownership of the pond in 1858 or thereabouts was predominantly Anthony Snow Collins and John C. Knowles. Collins owned 8 shares, Knowles owned 7, and then there were a couple of other members of the associated members of that Hinckley clan. Isaac Tyler had married into the Hinckley clan, and Charles Gallagher married the woman who had lived with Anthony Snow Collins and Thankful Collins, Lucy Ellen Rich. So they might have gotten their shares as wedding presents or something along those lines. In any case, the number one shareholder was Anthony Snow Collins. Unfortunately for Collins and Knowles and their partners, the optimism of the early 1840s soon came up against a new reality. There were two irresistible and irreversible forces at work that would have ultimately spelled the end of Truro tide mills and the windmills. The first was geological, and that was that the Pamet Harbor was shoaling. And despite several efforts to maintain a navigable channel, the shoaling continued. And from 63 vessels in 1836, the number of vessels operating out of Truro slipped to 49 by 1855, and then sunk to only 10 by 1865. Most of those fishermen moved to Provincetown. And until a new industry could replace fishing, the town of Truro was on an inevitable path of shrinking population, which is not good if you're a miller. Between 1850 and 1860, the population fell back to 1830 levels, and the population continued to decline all the way into the 20th century. The second major force at work was the steam engine. Coal-fired steam engines, coal-fired steam mills were producing grain on the were grinding grain on the mainland. They could produce 10 to 12 times as much flour per day as a tide mill, and they could do it at a lower cost. And not only that, but the steam engine could be used to power steam ships and ultimately to power locomotives, which could transport that ground grain. So faced with this situation, with a shrinking population and competition from the mainland, the Truro tide mill went out of business. In the 1860 census, Collins' profession is no longer listed as miller. It's now listed as seaman. And by the mid-1860, John C. Knowles, Collins' primary partner in the mill, was selling his shares. In 1864, his deed of sale to a guy named George Kelly requires continued care of the dam and the ditch, suggesting that perhaps the mill was able to continue operating at that point, even if not full-time. But by 1867, one of Knowles' deeds in a sale to Henry Holsbury describes the pond as the former mill pond. So it was definitely out of business by 1867. Just quickly, these are the graves of Anthony Snow Collins over here, Thankful Collins, and Lucy Ellen Rich, who's buried with them. Collins' grave is very interesting because the inscription on it shows that although he was an active member of the community in many ways, he either himself or those who wrote his inscription still regarded him as a foreigner, because it says, "Asleep in Jesus, far from thee, thy kindred and their graves may be." So it's talking about his kindred in Portugal, presumably being a long way from him. These graves are in Snow's Cemetery. The mill remained standing for several years. Deeds from 1874 and 1878 reference it, and it must have been dismantled between 1878 and 1884 when that history of Plymouth County was written. The millstones remained in place until around 1920, and here's a picture from the reading room at the Highland House. It's from a Snow family history. This is Charles W. Snow, then a inspector of roads of Truro, moving the millstones away from Mill Pond Road. And where did they go? We don't know where one of them is, but we do know where the other one is. This is the tombstone of Charles W. Snow and his wife Abby and their daughter Anna, also in Snow's Cemetery. You can see the scythe pattern of it. The millstone's about 5 feet in diameter. It's a very large stone, which again, go back to how much power is required to turn that stone. We don't know what became of the mill building. There's an intriguing item in a 1900 article in the Barnstable Patriot, which refers to a Warren W. Small of North Truro having purchased the watermill of William T. Atkins, which is to be erected in Truro on his property, that is Small's property. It's possible that was the same windmill or tide mill, but there's no reason to believe it necessarily was. In any case, it's almost certain that the Tide Mill would have been reused. And so if anyone has any idea of a building in Truro that might be the Tide Mill, I would love to hear about that. Those of you who have walked along Mill Pond Road, where it intersects with Depot Road, might have seen a pile of stones. And we don't know, but it is possible, just given their location and a couple of anecdotal stories, it's possible that these were in fact either foundation stones and or sluiceway stones from the Tide Mill. And Meg and I and our neighbors, Linda and Phil Herman, have actually gone through and measured and cataloged them so that we have something to work with if we can determine that they are in fact associated with the mill. And again, another request, anyone who is a geologist who might be able to help us with understanding what these stones were, we would love to hear from you as well. We have a tremendous opportunity coming up in terms of archaeology because there is a mill pond restoration project which is going to restore tidal flows into Mill Pond and try to return Mill Pond to a tidal situation which is roughly what it would have been about the time that the original dam was built there. This image is from a 2012 study of the pond. Further work is going on right now to prepare for this project. And assuming that that would involve an excavation of the culvert area, that's exactly where the mill once was. So there's an opportunity to incorporate an archaeological component into the restoration project. Finally, let's talk about the future and the potential for tidal energy in the future. The publication you see here in the center is from the International Renewable Energy Agency. It is a 2014 study that catalogs existing projects, planned projects, and technologies for tidal energy, and it's very optimistic about the potential for tidal energy. Tidal energy never really totally went away. This lower left here is a project in a place called La Rance in France. And the La Rance project is a tidal power project. It's 240 megawatts. It's based on a dam across this tidal estuary. There's a couple of issues with dams. One is that they obviously inhibit navigation. They also sometimes have been known to cause sedimentation issues, and there are also always, frequently fisheries issues as well. But this facility has operated since 1966. It's fully depreciated, so it's producing very reasonably priced electricity. The newer projects are being developed in two locations primarily. One, and this picture in the upper left is of a new test project, is in the Bay of Fundy. And this is in a place called Grand Passage where currents are about 10 knots. The other place, and we'll come back to this one, is in the Orkney Islands off of Scotland, where there's a European Center for Ocean Energy Research. This particular project in the Bay of Fundy involves a company called Sustainable Marine Energy. And this particular platform can have a number of these propellers that could take it from 60 or 70 kilowatts up to about 420 kilowatts. If we come around here to the lower right, this is a project that has just been deployed in the Orkney Islands. It is currently producing 2 megawatts of electricity, so it's 4 times more than the one up there in the Bay of Fundy, and it is supplying that electricity into the grid in the Orkney Islands. So this is a very real technology. The total potential of tidal energy is huge. The US Department of Energy estimates that if only 5% of US resources in the tidal area were utilized, that would account for 1.1 million homes of electricity. So there's huge potential. The biggest issue right now, beyond the technical challenges of operating in a harsh marine environment, the biggest challenge is to bring the price down, the cost per kilowatt hour. And these new modular technologies where you could anchor a series of these types of units, similar to what is done in a modern wind farm, could be the way that one produces electricity at a lower cost, and it doesn't require the construction of a dam. So there's a lot of optimism about some of these technologies and what it could mean for the future. And with that, let's close with a sunset on Mill Pond Road on top of the dam. This is what Anthony Snow Collins might have soaked in after a day of milling and before walking down Depot Road for supper with Thankful and Lucy Ellen. And speaking of thankful, I am deeply thankful to all of you for your attention and would be very glad to take any questions or discuss any points in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was fabulous. I am going to pose a question to you that was emailed to me a couple weeks ago from Alan Barstow from UPenn, and his question is, were there any tide mills in the 1800s that worked on both incoming and outgoing tides?
Yes, there were a few, but not very many. First of all, in some of the modern ones, they almost all are working in both directions. So it makes sense if you can do it to work in both directions. But in the 1800s, the one in Truro almost certainly did not. And that's because you have to hold back the water and then release it when the tide has gone out on the other side. And you can't do that in both directions. So they only would have done one direction. But I said there are some. There were essentially floating mills that had wheels on both sides, and they could operate just like these newer technologies that we just looked at. They could operate with tides going in both directions. So you could imagine anchoring one of those at the mouth of the Pamet River and having it operate both on incoming and outgoing tides. But it didn't happen very often.
Okay, we've got a question from Sarah Richards, who wants to know, why do you think solar and wind power have taken off so much more than tidal as a renewable energy source?
Good question, because obviously tidal power has been known just as long as wind power. The big thing is tidal power has to operate in a harsh marine environment. We've also shifted, in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, we were dealing with mechanical power. It wasn't electricity. Now those units have to generate electricity, and if you're offshore, you have to be able to transfer that power back onto shore. So there's a hostile, really tough, corrosive environment, not to mention the wave conditions, etc. And then there are those issues with competition with fisheries, sedimentation if you're thinking of putting a dam in, and ultimately there hasn't been enough scale yet. But I think the potential is there. The tidal power industry can learn from things like offshore drilling and offshore wind farms, which are also just beginning to take off. And I think there is potential to really see some major changes in the coming 10 years or so.
Great. Question from Ron Fichtner. Were tide mills ever used to generate electricity?
Well, the new ones we talked about are, but back in the period we were talking about, not that I know of. Maybe at the very end of the 19th century, but I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay. From Mike Miller, does the house you showed us where Anthony and Thankful live still exist?
Yes. Yeah, it's 41 Depot Road. It still exists. It's there.
Okay. Tim, are you aware of any other tide mills on the Outer Cape?
Good question. Yes. I haven't had a chance to research very many of them, or I've had no chance to research any of them at a level like this. There's a woman who's blogging in Wellfleet who has a posting about a tide mill that was on Logie Bay, which is kind of behind Lieutenant Island. It's pretty well documented. There was definitely another one on Blackfish Creek near the head of Blackfish Creek, and there was one on the Herring River where Mill Creek goes into the Herring River. The Mill Creek is flowing kind of through the golf course at Chequesset, and at the head of that was a tide mill, and that's just Wellfleet. There's a lot more.
Great. From Helen McNeil Ashton, congratulations, Tim, on your original presentation. Helen says this is just how the resources of the Cobb Archive should be used. And
Yay. Thank you.
Got a couple questions for you. How early have you established Thomas Paine operating a mill? And how does water flow in a reaction wheel?
So the Thomas Paine question, it's real. Most of what I know about this actually comes from the Eastham Historical Society, who has the history of that mill, and so I don't have anything beyond that. And the unfortunate thing about reaction wheels is we haven't been able to find a good illustration of one. So there are technical descriptions, which I won't even attempt to go into. The simplest way to think about it, the thing that I can actually relate to is a reaction wheel worked kind of like the way one of those rotating garden sprinkler systems work. The ones that spin around, they spurt the water out and spin around. That's essentially what it worked, except that the wheel was enclosed between two pieces of steel, probably circular pieces of steel, and then the water squirted in and it came out through those jets, and that's what caused it to spin. But unfortunately, we don't have a picture of one. If anyone has a picture of a reaction wheel, Bob Gordon and I would love to see it, and we would be happy to study it closely.
Okay, from Mike Miller, can you tell us anything more about what happened to all those industrial buildings at the harbor during its heyday?
Well, that's not really the primary thing I focused on. You mean, so where are they now? You know, if you look at a few spots around the harbor, you do see a lot of wooden piers. And this is just completely speculation, but some of those were the railroad bridge. But aside from that, there seem to be a few places where there are older piers that were probably associated with some of those buildings and some of those wharves. But Michael, I really don't know, and haven't tried to get into that much yet. I'll tell you right over on Eagle's Neck, right at the end of it, there are definitely there's definitely wooden structures embedded in the mud.
Okay, question from Bill Card. What was the relative timing of the railroad across the estuary, and could that have reduced the flow through the tide mill?
The railroad came in after the tide mill had already gone out of business. So when the railroad came in 1772, they installed a culvert at the railroad bed, and the culvert was a one-way culvert, sort of like what has been there for the Pamet River at Route 6. So water could flow out from the Mill Pond, Mill Creek side, but no salt water could come in. So that was a huge change in the ecology of Mill Creek and Mill Pond. But anyway, it occurred after the mill had already gone out of business.
Okay, I'm just scrolling down to see if I've missed any. John Young said railroad 1872, not 1772, right?
Did I say 17? 1872.
Okay, and there's a comment from Beth Chapman that there are photos of Pamet Harbor before the advent of the railroad around 1875 that show a very different configuration of the harbor than what we see today.
Yeah. I've looked at a couple of those photographs. Of course, by 1875, things were on the downside for the harbor, but still there was, I know the wharf continued the Union Wharf, which was one of the three major wharfs, continued to operate for quite a few years, probably up to the period just referenced.
Another question came in from Robert Ross. Was there an industry to manufacture the millstones? And if you have the answer, where was that industry headquartered?
Right. So there were, obviously there's no, these were granite millstones. So there wasn't any granite to speak of, or at least not any substantial quantities in the area here in Truro. we don't really know for sure, but when we've looked into it, one quarry that has granite that is quite similar to the one in Snows Cemetery is at Cape Nettic. And so it's possible that this is granite from that quarry. We really haven't looked into it in a lot of detail, but it seems to be the most likely. And some of the mills, especially in the early days, imported their millstones from France. The highest quality millstones were actually imported from France. Not all mills could afford that, but if you could afford it, it was the luxury standard.
Tim, a couple of people have asked if they have follow-up questions, how they might get in touch with you.
You can send me an email at timjrichards57@gmail.com. timjrichards57@gmail.com.
Great. And a number of just very sweet, positive comments. Jean O'Neill says, thank you. This is terrific and informative. Bill Carr says, thank you. Fascinating. And we've gotten a number of just people who are very pleased. Beth Chapman said, unbelievable. You answered many questions about Mill Pond that I've had. Your research is impressive. So tremendous thank you to Tim. I'm going to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia Ford and Marilyn Damon. We got a comment from Margaret Milne who said, wonderful presentation. She lives in Quincy and Summers in Eastham. So it was interesting for her to hear about the tide mill in Truro. And she mentions that Quincy has one as well.
Yes. Yeah, we've visited it. It's in pretty good condition.
All right. So I think we've gotten to everyone's questions. Thank you, Tim. This was a wonderful, wonderful program. And thank you to all of the attendees who've come to Tim's program. Look forward to seeing you all at some of our upcoming programs this summer. And as I mentioned earlier on, for any of you who might have missed the introduction, we have a program on Cape Cod gardening, same time next Wednesday with C.L. Fornari, who is a gardening expert and self-described plant geek. So I hope to see some of you again next week. Thanks again, Tim. Fabulous, fabulous program.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren.
Okay, have a great night.
Bye-bye.